Hey guys, so it's been a while since I've done a P-10C video, but I just got the new Gen 2 trigger from Cajun Gunworks. This is the G10 version, although they still make it with aluminum. They made a couple of changes between that and the original Gen 1. So kind of go over those for you. Wearing black gloves so that my skin here doesn't affect the white balance. Makes it a little bit easier to not have to adjust my camera all the time. So a lot of people replace the triggers on their P-10Cs. They don't really have to, so there's really nothing wrong with the trigger. Ergonomically, it's pretty much fine. The characteristics are fine. But some people get a little trigger pinch down here at the bottom. I'm one of those people. So when I pull the trigger, I tend to pull low, and I can feel my finger drag against the bottom of the trigger guard. And it's just where my finger ends up. You can keep trying to adjust it, but at the end of the day, my hands are my hands. So what happens is as the trigger resets, it basically comes forward and it kind of rolls this part of your finger, the bottom part of this little fleshy area, and it gets rolled underneath and gets pinched between the tip of the trigger and the trigger guard. So HBI sought to remedy that by adding this little hook. The idea being that it prevents your finger from riding down any lower. The problem I've had with it is because the two little fangs stick out past the safety, you still get a little pinch there when your skin still kind of gets wedged up in there. Cajun Gunworks, same kind of problem. When you look at focus, you can kind of see a gap there in the center, and so you still get a little bit of skin rolled up in there. So with the Gen 2, they extended the safety so that it's flush. And the overall length is slightly longer just to help fill that gap a little bit better. The other thing that's different when you look at the Gen 2 is when you look at the width of the flat portion. Get the light to reflect it there. So you can see that it's narrower here. This flat portion is about as wide as the trigger safety, where it's a little bit wider. Barely see the edge there. It's maybe 30–40% wider. So you get a little bit more flat face before it rounds off. So I really like that because as much as I like the flat trigger on the HBI, it's a little too squared off. So it forces my finger out a little bit further before I can kind of hook around it. What I've noticed with the Cajun Gunworks, it promotes pulling closer towards the first joint instead of out near the tip. I actually like pulling near the joint now because when you pull out near the tip, you've got all this squishy fat pad right there that you have to push through, and that's adding essentially to the trigger pull. By pulling more at the joint, there's less material there to fight through, so it's a little more direct pull. Also, you're working through 2 joints instead of 3, so there's just less overall movement, kind of throwing your shot off. The other change they made was to the safety. So you notice there's a piece of tape on here. If you don't have the tape, what will happen is the safety will just, I can't get it off because of these gloves. Basically, without the tape, the safety can just come all the way out and you can lose the spring in there. You can basically just do that. So, if you lost your set screw or you backed it off too far when trying to adjust it, you could basically disassemble the trigger. Not a huge deal. I mean, blue Loctite exists. It hasn't been a problem for mine, but some people didn't like that. So this new design, it's completely captured, so that's not a problem. The only problem I had with it, and a few people have had it, not everyone, basically this little rounded portion here isn't relieved enough, and I'll roll a picture in, but when it's mounted to the trigger guard, or sorry, to the trigger bar, the pin area would basically rub down here on the bottoms. So to clear some of that area, I just took a 1/16 punch and basically just scraped out the offending area. Maybe like 4 or 5 scrapes was all it took, and it took care of it. It might just be mine. It could just be a tolerance issue, but yeah. And then the other thing I was looking at was with aluminum, you can basically polish it before you anodize it, so you have a nice slick surface. So when it rotates, so like if this side area is rubbing up against the inside of the frame, you don't feel any friction. I was concerned that that might happen with the G10. The G10 is a little bit naturally grippy. It feels kind of like really fine, like 2000 grit sandpaper, right? Because it's basically, you know, paper that's been impregnated with resin. And so there's a little bit of traction, but as far as pulling, I didn't notice any additional resistance or any change in that, so that was fine. So anyway, I need to get it in the gun. I've had it in the gun a couple times. I took it out for this. I need to get a couple hundred rounds in. We had a bunch of snow down here in North Carolina, so I definitely want to shoot it. But as just dry firing, I can tell that as far as trigger pinch, it's gone. Like there's just none there. I just don't notice any resistance on the bottom of my finger. And as far as the pull characteristics, they're pretty much the same. So I built this little jig out of 80/20 aluminum and an old UTG RMR mount. And basically I can mount it to the Picatinny rail, mount my camera against here with a, I think it's a 1024 screw, and I can get really consistent pictures. So I'll roll those in. I'll roll those in now. So basically the green arrow is where the trigger is at rest. The yellow arrow is where the wall begins. And the red arrow is basically when the trigger is pulled all the way to the rear. There's really no way for me to visualize how the brake feels, but it's the same between all four. There's really no difference. The only thing that these triggers do is change the amount of pre-travel distance. Basically, some of the slack is taken up. So when you look at the HBI, it's got this little boss right here in that corner, and that just prevents the trigger from moving too far forward. Obviously, with the HBI, you have the set screws doing the same thing, and the OEM doesn't have one. That's why it sits so much further. When you look at the brake to over travel distance, they're basically the same all the way through. The only thing that does change the weight is where you put your finger on the trigger. So obviously if you're holding your finger lower, you're getting more leverage. So it's going to feel lighter at the expense of a longer arc. That's kind of why I like the HBI. It promotes your finger to sit a little bit higher because of the curve. So it does feel heavier than, say, the HBI. It feels about the same as the OEM. But you maintain that nice crisp brake that you're supposed to have when you have these. So yeah, let me get this trigger in the gun. Let me get a couple hundred rounds through it, and the video will continue from there. All right, so I've got the trigger installed in my FDE frame. I use the black frame because it doesn't affect the camera as much as far as light balance. But this is the one I actually shoot. So yeah, no huge difference that I can really tell. Just kind of idea of how much trigger pinch there is. I'm going to use this. So when you look at that bottom edge, you can kind of see how there's a, oh man, that's reflecting bad. You can kind of see that little bite that gets taken there, and it's obviously it's exaggerated because this is getting really squished up in there. But you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Maybe it's really hard to see because of the glare. But you can kind of see that little nip that gets taken there. So it looks worse on obviously on this because it's super squishy. But when I was dry firing this earlier, I didn't notice any adverse pinching. So gonna get a couple hundred rounds down range, play with it. I'm not expecting any problems, performance or otherwise. So, but gotta get my rounds in, and yeah. So. All right, I am back. I started this video about 2 months ago, and between the hurricane and winter weather and my work schedule and just personal stuff, just didn't have time to get out to the range and shoot. So the weather finally broke. I got back from out of town, and I put 250 rounds down range. I did some drills. I think the target I used was the Bear Solutions standard target. So it's like a 4x6 rectangle on each side and a little circle, and you just kind of transition back and forth. Yeah, trigger worked out great. Didn't notice, no complaints, felt just kind of like the original Gen 1 trigger. It didn't get hot at all. I noticed at the end of a long string I might get some heat coming in from the locking block into the trigger. Obviously with G10 that's not a problem. So I'm going to go ahead and check the trigger real quick. Originally it was 5.3 with the Gen 1. 4.1 or 4.13 seemed a little light. Let's try again. 4.12.4. All right, so I guess for whatever reason this one's a little bit lighter than the Gen 1. Didn't feel that way, but It might just be the way I'm pulling. 414, that's pretty consistent. So just under 5 pounds. Yeah, so super happy with it. So like I was kind of saying before, I know triggers are a personal thing. If you tend to hook more of the trigger and use more of that first joint, this is a really comfortable way to go. That slightly wider flat face still makes it great if you want to pull with your fingertip. But if you've got kind of shorter fingers, or you want something with that kind of fills the trigger guard a little bit more, the HBI with its flat face might be a little better. But for me, this is my favorite. So, oh, and also, I went ahead and picked up one of these. This is my first real CZ, since it's got the slide inside the frame. But I've always wanted to try playing around with a double single, so I got one of these. And yeah, so we'll see how this goes. I might put an RMR in it. I might send it to JagerWorks and get it done. I might send the frame off to Mac Defense and get it stippled up. This is my home stippling job, and it looks terrible, so I'll get it professionally done. Anyway, if you have any questions about P-10C or anything else I've kind of talked about, let me know. See you.